Next slide is super important, and if you are making any notes, could you please put an exclamation mark next to this slide? This is the key to your understanding of the whole module, the whole macroeconomics part of the module. This is the most important equation in macroeconomics. This is probably the single equation which you will need to memorize, which will help you to understand the rest of this module. This equation is so-called national accounting identity, which describes the components of aggregate demand. So let's define aggregate demand first. Aggregate demand measures the total spending on all goods and services produced in the economy over a period of time. Aggregate demand consists of several components, several elements. First of all, it's consumption, C. It's spending by households on goods and services for consumption purposes. It will also include investments or spending by firms on capital goods. Apart from this, it will also include government spending, spending on public goods and services, and net exports, the difference between exports and imports, which includes net spending of foreigners on domestic products. Let me show you this on our diagram. Let's try to see who will purchase the total output which we've produced. Households, our first group. Households will buy goods and services, and households will be the biggest purchaser of our products which we've produced. And expenditure by households on consumption will be denoted as C, consumption. But it's not just consumers who will buy goods and services, because firms will need to purchase some equipment as well. They will buy some of this output which they've produced. They will not buy their own output, but they will buy products produced by other companies. And expenditure by firms, their purchases for their own purposes, is called investment. Letter I, investments, which represents expenditure by companies. First, second. Consumption expenditure is the biggest proportion of total GDP. It accounts for about 2/3, about 70% of total aggregate demand. Investments is usually lower, it's about 20%, and investments is the most volatile component of GDP. It varies a lot over the course of the year. Just to give you an idea, if GDP varies like this, increases over time, and it fluctuates throughout the business cycle, then investment will fluctuate like that. Investment is very volatile. It goes considerably higher than overall GDP during boom periods, and it drops considerably lower compared to GDP during recessions, just to give you an idea. So consumption and investment are two biggest components or elements of aggregate demand. But there are some other sectors which buy our products as well. And the first sector will include government expenditure. The third sector, they will buy goods and services. And again, this is not it. There will be another sector which includes the rest of the world. Foreigners. We trade with the rest of the world. We buy some of their products and they purchase some of ours. Some of our output will be supplied abroad to foreigners. But because we don't just sell to them, but we buy of them as well, we will need to account for the net exports, the difference between what we buy and what we sell. So it will be shown as the difference between exports, what we sell to foreigners, and what we buy of them, imports. And all these four elements, consumption, government expenditure, net exports, plus investment, represents total aggregate demand in the economy. All demand, full demand for all our goods. It comes from four different sources. And what is important to understand is that change in any of these types of expenditure will change the level of aggregate demand, and it will cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve, which will cause chain reaction. It will change all other macroeconomic parameters, macroeconomic variables. So let me just demonstrate this effect. As I explained already, we can analyze situation within the national economy using the diagram with the aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. There are different reasons for this, but it's beyond the syllabus, so I will not go too much into these details. So we have price level along vertical axis. We'll need to get used to this notation. And we have yield or national output or GDP along horizontal axis, national output. We also have some aggregate supply curve. And intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply will determine equilibrium price level or inflation rate in a country, and also equilibrium national level of output. But have a look what happens. If there will be some changes in our formula, you will need to memorize this formula. We'll use it a lot all the time. Aggregate demand is equal to a sum of consumption expenditure, investment, government expenditure plus net exports. In some textbooks, you will see net exports shown as NX, just net exports. So have a look. Let's imagine that consumption expenditure goes up for whatever reasons. Maybe consumer income has increased, or they're very optimistic about the future, and as a result, they increase their consumption expenditure. This will increase the whole aggregate demand, the complete aggregate demand. When one element goes up, it will increase the whole. So as a result, when aggregate demand goes up, it will shift aggregate demand curve upwards. And our new aggregate demand curve will be located higher. So we'll move to a new equilibrium point E new, which will increase national output. Output will now be higher. So national output goes up as a result of this, as a result of higher consumption expenditure. But apart from this, we can also see that price level will increase as well. Inflation will accelerate. Prices will become higher. So due to some changes in the consumption spending by consumers, maybe because of the expectation or because they enjoy higher disposable income or for whatever other reasons, we will have the chain effect. Aggregate demand will increase, it will increase national output, and will also experience price pressure. Prices will go up, which will accelerate inflation. Higher national output also implies that employment level in the country will increase, because in order to produce more output, we will need to hire more workers. So more workers will be able to find a job. Employment level will go up and unemployment level will drop. Unemployment will drop. And all this happens as a result of the first initial initial injection from higher consumption expenditure by consumers. So as I mentioned in the previous lecture, in macroeconomics, all variables are related to each other. There is a very clear logic between all these changes in all these moves. And as long as you understand this logic, you will be able to understand how macroeconomy operates. Let's have a look at the next slide. Let's analyze the main determinants of aggregate demand. And if you're making notes, put an exclamation mark next to this slide. This is very, very, very important. First thing which we need to understand is that consumption behavior of consumers, their consumption spending depends on these four main determinants. First is the disposable income. This plus tells us that there is a positive relationship between consumption and disposable income. In other words, when disposable income goes up, consumption will increase. When we have more money in our pocket, we can spend more, and as a result, consumption expenditure will go up. Taxes. There is a negative relationship between consumption and taxes. What does it mean? It means that the higher the taxes, the lower consumption will be. Why is that? Because if we pay higher taxes, there will be lower disposable income. There will be lower income left for us to spend, and as a result, consumption expenditure will go down. Interest rates, they will also affect consumption behavior. They will also affect how much consumers are able to spend. And there is a negative relationship here as well, because the higher the interest rate, the higher the cost of borrowing, the more consumers will need to pay in interests on their debts, or credit card debt, overdraft, any mortgages, all car loans and everything. When we spend a lot on serving our debts, there will be less money left on other products and services. And as a result, high interest rates, more expensive borrowing implies that consumption will be lower. Or people simply won't be able to afford to buy a new, bigger house, for example, because mortgage payments will be unaffordable. They won't be able to get a new car because they cannot support this car loan, and so on. Expectations and consumer confidence will also affect consumer behavior, because if expectations are optimistic, consumers will be able to spend more regardless of their current income. And when expectations are pessimistic, they will cut down their consumption straight away. This is the first component of aggregate demand. Second component is investment. And there are two main factors which determine investment level in a country: interest rates and expectations. Interest rates, here the relationship is negative as well, because businesses usually borrow money when they want to expand. If you have some investment project in mind, very frequently you would need to finance it using borrowed money. And when costs of borrowing are high, when interest rates go up, it implies that very few investment projects will remain profitable. If you need to borrow money at, let's say, 15%, there will be very few projects which will generate sufficient profit to pay these interest expenses and still have some profit left for yourself to make this project worthwhile. So the higher the interest rates, the lower firms will be willing to borrow in order to expand, and the lower investment in the country will be. On the other hand, when interest rates are low, it implies that it will be very easy and attractive source of funding for companies, and they will be able to borrow money easily, and they will be able to invest this in order to generate profit in the future, and as a result, investment level in the country will increase. And the second factor which affects investment in a country is expectations and producer confidence. Obviously, when investors are very optimistic about the future, they are certain that companies will be able to generate profit, economy is booming, consumers are buying their products, they will be quite happy to invest in this country, and as a result, investment level will increase. While on the other hand, when expectations are very negative, for example, we expect a new wave of coronavirus, we expect new lockdowns, we know that many businesses will not survive, they will go bankrupt, and we won't be willing to invest in this particular situation. We don't want to put our money at risk, because if we spend this money in order to install a new production line, for example, but no one will be operating in this factory, no one will be working because the business will be shut due to social distancing rules, and we won't be able to sell our products, it means that we have frozen our money and with risk and without any opportunity to get any profit from it. And investors don't like these situations and they simply won't invest. So when expectations are negative, the level of investments in the country will be relatively low. Next component of aggregate demand, government expenditure, government spending. This is probably the easiest component to analyze because it's exogenous, which means that it doesn't depend on other macroeconomic variables. It's directly determined by the government. Government simply decides that this year we are going to spend such and such amount on schools, on hospitals, on road infrastructure, on supporting unemployed, and so on. They simply set a number themselves based on their own objectives. It doesn't depend on any other variables. It's given to us, so we simply take this number as given. And the final component of aggregate demand, net exports, the difference between exports and imports. This depends on exchange rates and income in our country. And interestingly, both relationships here are negative. In other words, the higher the exchange rate of our currency, the stronger the pound, the lower net exports will be. We will cover this in a little bit more details in one of the final lectures in this module. We'll study how exactly this takes place. But strangely enough, if you want to stimulate trade with the rest of the world, if you want to export more, you need to devalue your currency. You need to reduce the value of your currency. We'll come back to this later. But for now, just remember that exchange rates affect international trade flows. And another factor which will determine net exports will be income. And here the relationship is also negative. The higher the income, the lower net exports will be. What is the logic here? When income is high, consumers spend a lot of money. We get paid a lot, we have high income, so we want to spend this money. We buy lots of products, which means that we buy a lot of both domestic products and imported products. Most of us tend to buy quite a lot of imported goods. Even if you open your fridge, you will see that most of the items in your fridge will be imported. They will not be domestically produced. Think about bananas, oranges, various tinned products, and so on. Not everything will come from the UK. Even if you buy strawberries, they can come from Poland or Spain or different countries. So the higher the income, the more you spend on imported products, which will increase the amount of imports and reduce the amount of net exports, because it's the net exports, the difference between exports and imports, which will be included in our aggregate demand. So these are the factors which will affect different components of aggregate demand: consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. You will need to remember this, and you will need to understand the logic, how exactly different variables will affect each other, because change on any of these variables will change aggregate demand, and as a result it will shift aggregate demand curve, and it will lead to changes in national output and price level.